Welcome to the last session of The Secret Garden. This last session starts on chapter 26, and it's called Its Mother. Their belief in magic was an abiding thing, and after the morning's incantations, Collins sometimes gave them magic lectures. "I like to do it," he explained, "because when I grow up and make great scientific discoveries, I shall be obliged to lecture about them, and so this is practice. I can only give short lectures now because I'm very young, and besides, Ben Weatherstaff would feel as if we were in church and he would go to sleep." "The best thing about lecturing," said Ben, "is that a chap can get up and say what he pleases and no other chap can answer him back. I wouldn't be against lecturing a bit myself sometimes." But when Colin held forth under his tree, old Ben fixed devouring eyes on him and kept them there. He looked him over with critical affection. It was not so much the lecture which interested him as the legs which looked straighter and stronger every day, the boyish head which held itself up so well, the once sharp chin and hollow cheeks which had filled and rounded out, and the eyes which had begun to hold the light he remembered in another pair. Sometimes when Colin felt Ben's earnest gaze meant that he was much impressed, he wondered what he was reflecting on, and once when he seemed quite entranced, he questioned him. "What are you thinking about, Ben Weatherstaff?" he asked. "I was thinking," answered Ben, "as I'd warrant that gone on 3 or 4 pounds this week, I was looking at the calves and at thy shoulders. I'd like to get you a pair of scales." "It's the magic, and Mrs. Sowerby's buns and milk and things," said Colin. "You see, the scientific experiment has succeeded." He wants to weigh him. In other words, on a pair of scales, he's wanting to weigh Colin and see how much he's gained, that he thinks he's just gained a lot of weight. That morning, Dickon was too late to hear the lecture. When he came, he was ready with running, and his funny face looked more twinkling than usual. As they had a good deal of weeding to do after the rains, they fell to work. They always had plenty to do after a warm, deep, sinking rain. The moisture which was good for the flowers was also good for the weeds, which thrust up tiny blades of grass and points of leaves, which must be pulled up before their roots took them firm hold. Colin was good at weeding as any one of these days, and he would lecture while he was doing it. "The magic works best when you work yourself," he said. "You can feel it in your bones and muscles. I'm going to read books about bones and muscles, but I'm going to write a book about magic. I'm making it up now. I keep finding out things." It was not very long after he had said that as he laid down his trowel and stood up on his feet. He had been silent for several minutes, and they had seen that he was thinking out lectures, as he often did. When he dropped his trowel and stood upright, it seemed to Mary and Dickon as if a sudden strong thought had made him do it. He stretched himself out to his tallest height, and he drew out his arms exultantly. Color glowed in his face, and his strange eyes widened with joyfulness. All at once he realized something to the full. "Mary, Dickon," he cried, "look at me." They stopped their weeding and looked at him. "Do you remember the first morning you brought me in here?" he demanded. Dickon was looking at him very hard. Being an animal charmer, he could see more things than most people, and many of them were things that he never talked about. He saw some of them now in this boy. "Aye, we do," he answered. Mary looked hard too, but she said nothing. "Just this minute," said Colin. "All at once I remembered it myself, when I looked at my hand digging with the trowel, and I had to stand up on my feet to see if it was real. And it is real. I'm well. I'm well." "Oh, that thou art," said Dickon. I'm well," said Colin again, and his face went quite red all over. He had known it before in a way. He had hoped it and felt it and thought about it. But just at that minute, something rushed all through him, a sort of rapturous belief and realization, and it had been so strong that he could not help calling out. "I shall live forever and ever," he cried grandly. "I shall find out thousands and thousands of things. I shall find out about people and creatures and everything that grows, like Dickon, and I shall never stop making magic. I'm well, I'm well. I feel as if I want to shout out something thankful, joyful. Ben Weatherstaff, who'd been working near a rose bush, glanced around at him. Thou might sing the doxology, he suggested in his driest grunt. He had no opinion of the doxology, and he did not make the suggestion with any particular reverence. Now, the doxology is a song that is sung in church. But Colin was of exploring mind, and he knew nothing about the doxology. What is that? He inquired. Dickon can sing it for thee, I'll warrant, replied Ben Weatherstaff. Dickon answered with his animal charmer's smile. They sing it in church, he said. Mother says she believes the skylark sings it when they gets up in the morning. If she says that, then it must be a nice song, Colin answered. I've never been in a church myself. I was always too ill. Sing it, Dickon. I want to hear it. Dickon was quite simple and unaffected about it. He understood what Colin felt better, and then Colin did himself. He understood by a sort of instinct so natural that he did not know it was understanding. He pulled off his cap and looked around, still smiling. Thou must take off your cap, he said to Colin, and so much that, Ben, and then you must stand up, thou knows. Colin took off his cap, and the sun shone and warmed his thick hair as he watched Dickon intently. Ben Weatherstaff scrambled up from his knees and bared his head, too, with a sort of puzzled, half-resentful look on his old face, as if he didn't know exactly what he was doing and why he was doing this remarkable thing. Dickon stood out among the trees and the rose bushes, and he began to sing in a simple, matter-of-fact way and in a nice, strong boy voice. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. When he had finished, Ben Weatherstaff was standing quite still with his jaws set obstinately, but with a disturbed look in his eyes fixed on Colin. Colin's face was thoughtful and appreciative. That's a very nice song, he said. I like it. Perhaps it means just what I mean when I want to shout out that I am thankful to the magic. He stopped and thought in a puzzled way. Perhaps they both the same thing. How can we know the exact names of everything? Sing it again, Dickon. Let us try, Mary. I want to sing it too. It's my song. How does it begin? Praise God from whom all blessings flow. And they sang it again, and Mary and Colin lifted their voices as musically as they could, and Dickon swelled quite loud and beautiful. And on the second line, Ben Weatherstaff raspingly cleared his throat, and at the third he joined in with such vigor that it seemed almost savage. And when the Amen came to an end, Mary observed that the very same thing had happened to him that had happened when he found out that Colin was not a cripple. His chin was twitching, and he was staring and winking, and his leathery old cheeks were wet. In other words, he's crying. I never seed no sense in the doxology before, he said, but I may change my mind this time. I could say that and gone up 5 pounds this week, Master Collins, 5 of 'em. Colin was looking across the garden at something attracting his attention, and his expression had become a startled one. Who's coming in here? He said quickly. Who is it? The door in the ivied wall had been pushed gently open, and a woman had entered. She had come in with the last line of the song, and she had stood still listening and looking at them. With the ivy behind her, the sunlight drifting through the trees and dappling her long blue coat, and her nice fresh face smiling across the greenery, she was rather like a softly colored illustration in one of Colin's books. She had wonderful affectionate eyes which seemed to take everything in, all of them, even Ben Weatherstaff and the creatures and every flower that was in bloom. Unexpectedly as she had appeared, not one of them felt that she was an intruder at all. Dickon's eyes lighted like lamps. It's Mother, that's who it is, he cried, and he went across the grass at a run. Colin began to move toward her too, and Mary went with them. They both felt their pulses beat faster. It's Mother, Dickon said again when they met halfway. I know you'd want to see her, and I told her where the door was hid. Colin held out his hand with a soft, flushed royal shyness, but his eyes quite devoured her face. "Even when I was ill, I wanted to see you," he said. "You and Dickon and the secret garden. I never wanted to see anyone or anything before." The sight of his uplifted face brought a sudden change in her own. She flushed, and the corners of her mouth shook, and mist seemed to sweep over her eyes. "Oh, dear lad," she broke out, "dear lad," as if she had not known she was going to say it. She did not say Master Colin, but just "dear lad," quite suddenly. She might have said it to Dickon in the same way if she had seen something in his face which touched her. Colin liked it. "Are you surprised because I'm so well?" he asked. She put her hand on his shoulder and smiled the mist out of her eyes. I am," she said. "But thou art so like your mother that it made my heart jump." "Do you think," said Colin a little awkwardly, "that will make my father like me?" "Oh, for sure, dear lad," she answered, and she gave his shoulder a soft, quick pat. "He must come home. He must come home." "Susan Sowerby," said Ben Weatherstaff, getting close to her, "look at the lad's legs, wilt thou? They was like drumsticks and stocking 2 months ago, and I heard folk tell as they am bandy and knock-kneed both at the same time. But look at 'em now." Susan Sowerby laughed a comfortable laugh. "They're going to be fine, strong lad's legs in a bit," she said. "Let 'em go on playing and working in the garden and eating hearty and drinking plenty of good sweet milk, and there'll not be a finer pair in Yorkshire. Thank God for it." She put both hands on Mistress Mary's shoulders and looked her little face over in a motherly fashion. "And thee, too," she said. "You art grown as hearty as our Elizabeth Ellen. I'll warrant it, like the mother, too. Our Martha told me, as Mrs. Medlock heard, that she was a pretty woman. Thou'll be a blush rose when you grow up, my little lass, bless thee." She did not mention that when Martha came home on her day out and described the plain, sallow child, she had said she had no confidence whatever in what Mrs. Medlock had heard. "It doesn't stand to reason that a pretty woman could be your mother of such a foul little lass," she said obstinately. So in other words, they couldn't figure out how this little ornery little girl who came could turn out to be such a nice, pretty woman like her mother had been. Mary had not had time to pay much attention to her changing face. She'd only known that she looked different and seemed to have a great deal more hair, and that it was growing very fast. But remembering her pleasure in looking at the Mem Sahib in the past, she was glad to hear that she might someday look like her. So Mem Sahib is what she had called her mother in India. Susan Sowerby went around the garden with them and has told the whole story of it and showed every bush and tree which had come alive. Colin walked on one side of her and Mary on the other. Each of them kept looking up at her comfortable rosy face, secretly curious about the delightful feeling she gave them, a sort of warm, supported feeling. It seemed as if she understood them as Dickon understood his creatures. She stooped over the flowers and talked about them as if they were children. Soot followed her and once or twice cawed at her and flew upon her shoulder as if it were Dickon's. When they told her about the robin and the first flight of the young ones, she laughed a motherly little mellow laugh in her throat. "I suppose learning 'em to fly is like learning children to walk, but I'm feared I should be all worried if mine had wings instead of legs," she said. It was because she seemed such a wonderful woman in her nice moorland cottage that at last she was told about the magic. "Do you believe in magic?" asked Colin after he had explained about the Indian facos. "I do hope you do." "Oh, that I do, lad," she answered. "I never knowed it by that name, but what does the name matter? I warrant they call it a different name in France and a different one in Germany. The same thing as the seeds swelling and the sun shining made thee well, lad, and that's a good thing. It isn't like us poor fools as thinks it matters if us called out of our names. The big good thing doesn't stop to worry, bless thee. It goes on making worlds by million, worlds like us. Never stop believing in the big good thing and knowing that the world's full of it, and call it what you like. Thou were singing to it when I came into the garden." In other words, that's this big good thing she's talking about is God. That they think it's magic, but she's explaining this big good thing really is God. I felt so joyful, said Colin, opening his beautiful, strange eyes at her. Suddenly, I felt how different I was, how strong my arms and legs were, and how I could dig and stand. And I jumped up and I wanted to shout out something to anything that would listen. The magic listened when they sang the doxology. It would have listened to anything you sang. It was the joy that mattered. Oh, lad, what's name is the joy maker? And she gave his shoulders a quick, soft pat again. Again, the joy maker, she's referring to God. She had packed a basket which held a regular feast this morning. And when the hungry hour came and Dickon brought it out from his hiding place, she sat down with them under the tree and watched them devour their food, laughing and quite gloating over their appetites. She was full of fun and made them laugh at all sorts of odd things. She told them stories in broad Yorkshire and taught them new words. She laughed as if she could not help it when they told her of the increasing difficulty they were in pretending that Colin was still a fretful invalid. You see, we can't help laughing nearly all the time when we're together, explained Colin, and it doesn't sound ill at all. We try to choke it back, but it'll burst out and the sound's worse than ever. There's one thing that comes into my mind so often, said Mary, and I can scarcely ever hold it in when I think of it suddenly. I keep thinking, suppose Colin's face should get to look like a full moon. It isn't like one yet, but he gets a tiny bit fatter every day. And suppose some morning it should look like one. What should we do? Bless us all, I can see that's a good bit of play acting to do, said Susan Sowerby. But thou won't have to keep it much longer. Master Craven will be coming home. Do you think he will? Asked Colin. Why? Susan Sowerby chuckled softly. I suppose it's a nigh break thy heart if he found out before thou told him in thy own way. They's laid awake nights planning it. I couldn't bear anyone else to tell him, said Colin. I think about different ways every day, and I think now I just want to run into his room. That'd be a fine start for him, said Susan Sowerby. I'd like to see his face, lad. I would. He must come back, and then he must. One of the things they talked of was the visit they were to make to her cottage. They planned it all. They were to drive over the moor and lunch out of doors among the heather. They would see all the 12 children and Dickon's garden and would not come back until they were tired. Susan Sowerby got up at last to return to the house and Mrs. Medlock. It was time for Colin to be wheeled back also. But before he got in his chair, he stood quite close to Susan and fixed his eyes on her with a kind of bewildered adoration, and he suddenly caught hold of the fold of her blue coat and held it fast. You are just like what I wanted, he said. I wish you were my mother, as well as Dickens. All at once, Susan Sowerby bent down and drew him with her warm arms close against the bosom under the blue coat, as if she had been Dickens' brother. The quick mist swept over her eyes. Oh, dear lad, thy own mother is in this garden, I do believe. She couldn't keep out of it. The Father must come back to thee. He must. Chapter 27, In the Garden. In each century since the beginning of the world, wonderful things have been discovered. In the last century, more amazing things were found out than in any century before. In this new century, hundreds of things still more astounding will be brought to light. At first, people refuse to believe that a strange new thing can be done, and then they begin to hope it can be done, and then they see that it can be done, and then it is done, and all the world wonders why it was not done centuries ago. One of the new things people began to find out in the last century was that the thoughts, just mere thoughts, are as powerful as electric batteries, as good for one as sunlight is, or as bad for one as poison. To let a sad thought or a bad one get into your mind is as dangerous as letting scarlet fever germ get into your body. If you let it stay there after it got in, you might never get over it as long as you live. So as long as Mistress Mary's mind was full of disagreeable thoughts about her dislikes and sour opinions of people, and her determination not to be pleased or be interested in anything, she was yellow-faced, sickly, bored, and a wretched child. Circumstances, however, were kind to her, though she was not aware of it. They began to push her about for her own good. When her mind gradually filled itself with robins and moorland cottages crowded with children, with queer crabbed old gardeners and common little Yorkshire housemaids, with springtime and with secret gardens coming alive day by day, and also with a moor boy and his creatures, there was no room left for the disagreeable thoughts which affected her liver and her digestion and made her yellow and tired. So long as Colin shut himself up in his room and thought only of his fears and weakness and his detestation of people who looked at him and reflected hourly on humps and early death, he was a hysterical, half-crazy little hypochondriac who knew nothing of the sunshine and the spring and also did not know that he could get well and could stand on his feet as if he tried to do it. When new, beautiful thoughts began to push out the old, hideous ones, life began to come back to him. His blood ran healthily through his veins and strength poured into him like a flood. His scientific experiment was quite practical and simple, and there was nothing weird about it at all. Much more surprising things can happen to anyone when a disagreeable or discouraged thought comes into his mind, just as a sense to remember in time and push it out by putting in an agreeable, determinedly courageous one. Two things cannot be in one place. Where you tend a rose, my lad, a thistle cannot grow. While the secret garden was coming alive and two children were coming alive with it, there was a man wandering about certain faraway, beautiful places in the Norwegian fjords and the valleys and the mountains of Switzerland, and he was a man who for 10 years had kept his mind filled with dark and heartbroken thinking. Now they're talking about Colin's father now. He had not been courageous. He had never tried to put any other thoughts in the place of the dark ones. In other words, those dark spots are him remembering the death of his wife. He had wandered by blue lakes and thought them. He had lain on mountainsides with sheets of deep blue gentians blooming all about him and flower breasts filling all the air, and he had thought them. A terrible sorrow had fallen upon him when he had been happy, and he let his soul fill itself with blackness, and he refused obstinately to allow any rift of light to pierce through. He had forgotten and deserted his home and his duties. When he traveled about, darkness so brooded over him that the sight of him was a wrong done to other people, because it was as if he poisoned the air about him with gloom. Most strangers thought he must be either half mad or a man with some hidden crime on his soul. He was a tall man with a drawn face and crooked shoulders, and the name he always entered on hotel registers was Archibald Craven, Misselthwaite Manor, Yorkshire, England. He had traveled far and wide since the day he saw Mistress Mary in his study and told her she might have her bit of earth. He had been in the most beautiful places in Europe, though he remained nowhere more than a few days. He had chosen the quietest and remotest spots. He had been on the tops of mountains whose heads were in the clouds, and he'd looked down on other mountains when the sun rose and touched them with such light as made it seem as if the world were just being born. But the light had never seemed to touch himself until one day when he realized that the first time in 10 years, a strange thing had happened. He was in a wonderful valley in the Austrian Tyrol, and he'd been walking alone through such beauty as might have lifted any man's soul out of the shadow. He walked a long way, and it had not lifted his. But at last he felt tired and had thrown himself down to rest on a carpet of moss by a stream. It was a clear little stream which ran merrily along on its narrow way through the luscious, damp greenness. Sometimes it made a sound rather like a low laughter as it bubbled over and round stones. He saw birds come and dip their heads to drink in it, and then flick their wings and fly away. It seemed like a thing alive, and yet its tiny voice made the stillness seem deeper. The valley was very, very still. As he sat gazing into the clear running of the water, Archibald Craven gradually felt his mind and body both grow quiet as the valley itself. He wondered if he were going to sleep, but he was not. He sat and gazed at the sunlit water, and his eyes began to see things growing at its edge. There was one lovely mass of blue forget-me-nots growing so close to the stream that its leaves were wet, At these he found himself looking as he remembered he had looked at such things years ago. He was actually thinking tenderly how lovely it was and what wonders of blue its hundreds of little blossoms were. He did not know that just that simple thought was slowly filling his mind, filling and filling it until other things were softly pushed aside. It was as if a sweet, clear spring had begun to rise in a stagnant pool, and he had risen and risen until at last it swept the dark water away. But of course he did not think of this himself. He only knew that the valley seemed to grow quieter and quieter as he sat and stared at the bright, delicate blueness. He did not know how long he sat there or what was happening to him, but at last he moved as if he were wakening, and he got up and stood on the moss carpet, drawing a long, deep, soft breath and wondering at himself. Something seemed to have been unbound and released in him, very quietly. "What is it?" he said, almost in a whisper. He passed his hand over his forehead. "I almost feel as if I were alive." I do not know enough about the wonderfulness of undiscovered things to be able to explain how this happened to him. Neither does anyone else yet. He did not understand it all himself, but he remembered this strange hour months afterward when he was at Misselthwaite again, and he found out quite by accident that on this very day Colin had cried out as he went into the secret garden, "I'm going to live forever and ever and ever." The singular calmness remained with him the rest of the evening, and he slept a new reposed sleep. But it was not with him very long. He did not know that it could be kept. But the next night he opened the doors wide to his dark thoughts, and they had come trooping and rushing back. He left the valley and went on his wandering way again. But strange as it seemed to him, there were minutes and sometimes half hours when, without knowing why, the black burden seemed to lift itself, and he knew he was a living man and not a dead one. Slowly, for no reason that he knew of, he was coming alive with the garden. As the golden summer changed into the deep golden autumn, he went to the Lake of Como. There he found the loveliness of a dream. He spent his days upon the crystal blueness of the lake as he walked back into the soft, thick verdure of the hills and tramped until he was tired so that he might sleep. But by this time he began to sleep better, he knew, and his dreams had ceased to be of terror to him. Perhaps he thought, "My body is growing stronger." It was growing stronger, but because of the rare peaceful hours when his thoughts were changed, his soul was growing stronger too. So in other words, his father is slowly coming out of his grief. He's growing happier, just at the same time his son is back at Misselthwaite, but he doesn't know it. He began to think of Misselthwaite and wonder if he should not go home. Now and then he wondered vaguely about his boy and asked himself what he should feel when he went and stood by the carved four-posted bed again and looked down at the sharply chiseled ivory white face while it slept, and the black lashes rimmed so startlingly the close-shut eyes. He shrank from it. One marvel of a day, he had walked so far that when he returned the moon was high and full, and all the world was a purple shadow and silver. The stillness of lake and shore and wood was so wonderful he did not go into the villa he lived in. He walked down to a little bowered terrace at the water's edge and sat upon a seat and breathed in all the heavenly sense of the night. He felt a strange calmness stealing over him, and it grew deeper and deeper until he fell asleep. He did not know when he fell asleep, and when he began to dream, his dream was so real he did not feel as if he were dreaming. He remembered afterward how intensely wide awake and alert he had thought he was. He thought as he sat and breathed in the scent of the late roses and listened to the lapping of the water at his feet, he heard a voice calling. It was sweet and clear and happy and far away. It seemed very far, but he heard it as distinctly as if he had been at his side. "Archie, Archie, Archie," it said, and again, sweeter and clearer than before. "Archie, Archie." He thought he sprang to his feet, not even startled. It was such a real voice, and it seemed so natural that he should hear it. "Lilias, Lilias," he answered. "Lilias, where are you?" In the garden, it came back like a sound from a golden flute. In the garden. And then the dream ended. But he did not awaken. He slept soundly and sweetly all through the lovely night. When he did wake at last, it was brilliant morning, and a servant was standing staring at him. He was an Italian servant and was accustomed, as all the servants of the villa were, to accepting without question any strange thing the foreign master might do. No one ever knew when he would go out or come in, or where he would choose to sleep, or where he would roam around the garden or lie in the boat on the lake all night. The man held a salver with some letters in it, and he waited quietly until Mr. Craven took them. When he had gone away, Mr. Craven sat a moment, holding them in his hand and looking at the lake. His strange calm was still upon him, and something more, a lightness, as if the cruel thing which had been done had not happened as he thought, as if something had changed. He was remembering the dream, the real dream. In the garden, he said, wondering in himself, in the garden, but the door is locked and the key is buried deep. When he glanced at the letters a few minutes later, he saw that one lying on the top was an English letter and came from Yorkshire. It was directed in a plain woman's hand, but it was not a hand he knew. He opened it scarcely, thinking of the writer, but the first few words attracted his attention at once. Dear Sir, I am Susan Sowerby, that made bold to speak to you once on the moor. It was about Miss Mary that I spoke. I will make bold to speak again. Please, sir, I would come home if I was you. I think you would be glad to come, and if you will excuse me, sir, I think your lady would ask you to come if she was here. Your obedient servant, Susan Sowerby. Your lady means if your wife was alive, she would want you to go home. Mr. Craven read the letter twice before he put it back in its envelope. He kept thinking about the dream. I will go back to Misselthwaite, he said. I'll go at once. And he went through the garden to the villa and ordered Pitcher to prepare for his return to England. In a few days he was in Yorkshire again, and on his long railroad journey he found himself thinking of his boy as he never thought in all the 10 years past. During those years he had only wished to forget him. Now, though, he did not intend to think about him. Memories of him constantly drifted into his mind. He remembered the black days when he raved like a madman because the child was alive and his mother was dead. He refused to see it, and when he'd gone to look at it last, it had been such a weak, wretched little thing that everyone had been sure it would die in a few days. Now he's talking about the child, talking about Colin when he was a baby. But to the surprise of those who took care of it, the days passed and it lived, and then everyone believed it would be deformed and a crippled creature. He had not meant to be a bad father, but he had not felt like a father at all. He had supplied doctors and nurses and luxuries, but he had shrunk from the mere thought of the boy and buried himself in his own misery. The first time after a year's absence, he returned to Misselthwaite, and the small, miserable-looking thing languidly and indifferently lifted to his face the great gray eyes with black lashes around them, so like and yet so horribly unlike the happy eyes he adored. He could not bear the sight of them, and he turned away, pale as death. After that, he scarcely ever saw him except when he was asleep, and all he knew of him was that he was a confirmed invalid with a vicious, hysterical, half-insane temper. He could only be kept from furies dangerous to himself by being given his own way in every detail. All this was not an uplifting thing to recall, but as the train whirled him through the mountain passes and golden plains, the man who was coming alive began to think in a new way, and he thought long and steadily and deeply. Perhaps I've been all wrong for 10 years, he said to himself. 10 years is a long time. It may be too late to do anything, quite too late. What have I been thinking of? Of course, was the wrong magic to begin by saying too late. Even Colin could have told him that. But he knew nothing of magic, either black or white. This he had yet to learn. He wondered if Susan Sowerby had taken courage and written to him only because the motherly creature had realized that the boy was much worse or was fatally ill. If he had not been under the spell of the curious calmness which had taken possession of him, he would have been more wretched than ever. But the calm brought a sort of courage and hope with it. Instead of giving way to thoughts of the worst, he actually found he was trying to believe in better things. Could it be possible that she sees that I may be able to do him good and control him? He thought. I will go and see her on my way to Misselwaite. But when on his way across the moor, he stopped the carriage at the cottage. 7 or 8 children who were playing about, gathered in a group, bobbing 7 or 8 friendly and polite curtsies, told him that their mother had gone to the other side of the moor early in the morning to help a woman who had a new baby. Our Dickon, they volunteered, was over at the manor working in one of the gardens, where he went several days every week. Mr. Craven looked over the collection of sturdy little bodies and round, red-cheeked faces, each one grinning in its own particular way, and he awoke to the fact that they were a healthy, likable lot. He smiled at their friendly grins and took a golden sovereign from his pocket and gave it to our Elizabeth Ellen, who was the oldest. In other words, he took some money out of his pocket to give to the oldest child. If you divide that into 8 parts, there will be half a crown for each of you, he said. Then amid grins and chuckles and bobbing of curtsies, he drove away, leaving ecstasy and nudging elbows and little jumps of joy behind. So half a crown was be similar, like if you gave them $1 and they'd get 50 cents, but it was worth a lot more money than that. The drive across the wonderfulness of the moor was a soothing thing. Why did it seem to give him a sense of homecoming, which he had been sure he could never feel again? The sense of the beauty of land and sky and purple bloom of distance, and a warming of the heart at drawing near to the great old house, which had held those of his blood for 600 years. How had he driven away from it the last time, shuddering to think of its closed rooms and the boy lying in that 4-poster bed with the brocaded hangings? Was it possible that perhaps he might find him changed a little for the better, and that he might overcome his shrinking from him? How real that dream had been! How wonderful and clear the voice which called him back to him. In the garden, in the garden. I will try to find the key, he said. I will try to open the door. I must, though I don't know why. When he arrived at the manor, the servants who received him with the usual ceremony noticed that he looked better, and he did not go to the remote rooms where he usually lived, attended by Pitcher. Remember, Pitcher's his servant. He went into the library and sent for Mrs. Medlock. She came in to him somewhat excited, curious, and flustered. "How is Master Colin, Medlock?" he inquired. "Well, sir," Mrs. Medlock answered. "He's different in a manner of speaking." "Worse?" he suggested. Mrs. Medlock really was flushed. "Well, you see, sir," she began to explain, "neither Dr. Craven nor the nurse nor me exactly can make him out." "Why is that?" "Well, to tell the truth, sir, Master Colin might be better, and he might be changing for the worse. His appetite is past understanding, and his ways—" "Has he become more peculiar?" Master asked, knitting his brows. "That's it, sir. He's growing more peculiar when you compare him from what he used to be. He used to eat nothing, and then suddenly began to eat something enormous, and then he stopped again, and now the meals were sent back just as they used to be. You never know, sir, that out of doors he never would let himself be taken. The things we've gone through to get him to go out in his chair would leave a body trembling like a leaf. He'd throw himself into such a state that Dr. Craven said he couldn't be responsible for forcing him. Well, sir, just without warning, not long after one of his worst tantrums, he suddenly insisted on being taken out every day by Miss Mary and Susan Sowerby's boy, Dickon, that could push his chair. He took a fancy to Miss Mary and Dickon brought his tame animals, and if you'll credit it, sir, out of doors he will stay from morning until night." "How does he look?" was the next question. "If he took his food natural, sir, you'd think he was putting on flesh, but we're afraid it may be a sort of a bloat. He laughs sometimes in a queer way when he's alone with Miss Mary. He never used to laugh at all. Dr. Craven's coming to see you at once, if you'll allow him. He never was as puzzled in his life." "Where is Master Colin now?" Mr. Craven asked. "He's in the garden, sir. He's always in the garden, though not a human creature is allowed to go near for fear they'll look at him." Mr. Craven scarcely heard her last words. "In the garden," he said, and after he had sent Mrs. Medlock away and repeated it again, "in the garden." He had made an effort to bring himself back to the place he was standing in, and when he felt he was on earth again, he turned and went out of the room. He took his way, as Mary had done, through the door in the shrubbery and among the laurels and the fountain beds. The fountain was playing now and was encircled by beds of brilliant autumn flowers. He walked across the lawn and turned into the long walk by the ivied walls. He did not walk quickly, but slowly, and his eyes were on the path. He felt as if he were being drawn back to the place he had so long forsaken, and he did not know why. As he drew nearer to its step became still more slow. He knew where the door was, even though the ivy hung thick over it, but he did not know exactly where it lay, the buried key. So he stopped and stood still, looking about him, and almost that moment, after he paused, he started and listened, asking himself if he were walking in a dream. The ivy hung thick over the door. The key was buried under the shrubs. No human being had passed that portal for 10 lonely years, and yet inside the garden there were sounds. There were sounds of running, scuffling feet seeming to chase around, and round under the trees were strange sounds of lowered, suppressed voices, exclamations, and smothered, joyous cries. It seemed actually like the laughter of young things, the uncontrollable laughter of children who were trying not to be heard, but who in a moment or so, as their excitement mounted, would burst forth. What in heaven's name was he dreaming of? What in heaven's name did he hear? Was he losing his reason and thinking he heard things which were not for human ears? Was it that the far, clear voice had meant? And then the moment came, the uncontrollable moment when the sounds forgot to hush themselves. The feet ran faster and faster. They were nearing the garden door. There were quick, strong young breathing and a wild outbreak of laughing shouts which could not be contained. And the door in the wall was flung open wide and the sheet of ivy swinging back, and a boy burst through it at full speed and without seeing the outsider dashed almost into his arms. Mr. Craven had extended them just in time to save him from falling as a result of his unseeing dash against him. And when he held him away to look at him in amazement, his being there be truly gasped for breath. He was a tall boy and a handsome one. He was glowing with life, and his running had sent splendid color leaping into his face. He drew the thick hair back from his forehead and lifted a pair of strange gray eyes full of boyish laughter and rimmed with black lashes like a fringe. It was the eyes who made Mr. Craven gasp for breath. What? He stammered. This was not what Colin had expected. This was not what he planned. He never thought of such a meeting, and yet to come dashing out, winning a race, perhaps it was even better. He drew himself up to his tallest. Mary, who had been running with him and had dashed through the door too, believed that he managed to make himself look taller than he ever looked before. "Father," he said, "I'm Colin. You can't believe it. I scarcely can myself. I'm Colin." Like Mrs. Medlock, he did not understand what his father meant when he said hurriedly, in the garden. Yes, hurried on Colin. It was the garden that did it, and Mary and Dickon, and the creatures, and the magic. No one knows. We kept it to tell you when you came. I'm well. I can beat Mary in a race. I'm going to be an athlete. He said it so, all like a healthy boy, his face flushed, his words tumbling over each other in eagerness, that Mr. Craven's soul shook with unbelieving joy. Colin put out his hand and laid it on his father's arm. "Aren't you glad, Father? Aren't you glad? I'm going to live forever and ever and ever." Mr. Craven put his hands on both the boy's shoulders and held him still. He knew he dared not even try to speak for a moment. "Take me into the garden, my boy," he said at last, "and tell me all about it." And so they let him in. The place was a wilderness of autumn gold and purple and violet blue and flaming scarlet, and on every side were sheaves of late lilies standing together, lilies which were white and ruby. He remembered well when the first of them had been planted, that just at this season of the year their late glories should reveal themselves. Late roses climbed and hung and clustered, and the sunshine deepening the hue of the yellowing trees made one feel that one stood in an empowered temple of gold. The newcomer stood silent, just as the children had done when they came into its grayness. He looked round and round. "I thought it would be dead," he said. "Mary thought so first," said Colin, "but it came alive." Then they sat down under the tree, all but Colin, who wanted to stand while he told the story. It was the strangest thing he ever heard, Archibald Craven thought, as it was poured forth in a headlong boy fashion. Mystery and magic and wild creatures, the weird midnight meeting, the coming of the spring, the passion of insulted pride which had dragged the young Rajah to his feet to defy old Ben Weatherstaff to his face, the odd companionship, the play acting, the great secret so carefully kept. The listener laughed until tears came into eyes, and sometimes tears came into his eyes when he was not laughing. The athlete, the lecturer, the scientific discoverer was a laughable, lovable, healthy young human being. "Now," he said at the end of the story, "it need not be a secret anymore. I dare say it will frighten them nearly into fits when they see me, but I'm never going to get into that chair again. I shall walk back with you, Father, to the house." Ben Weatherstaff's duties rarely took him away from the gardens, but on this occasion he made an excuse to carry some vegetables to the kitchen, and being invited into the servants' hall by Mrs. Medlock to drink a glass of beer, he was on the spot, as he had hoped to be, when the most dramatic event Misselthwaite Manor had seen during the present generation actually took place. One of the windows looking upon the courtyard gave also a glimpse of the lawn. Mrs. Medlock, knowing Ben had come from the gardens, hoped that he might have caught sight of his master, and even by chance of the meeting with Master Colin. "Did you see either of them, Weatherstaff?" she asked. Ben took his beer mug from his mouth and wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Aye, that I did," he answered, with a shrewdly significant air. "Both of 'em?" suggested Mrs. Medlock. "Both of 'em," returned Ben Weatherstaff. "Thank you kindly, ma'am. I should sup up another mug of it. In other words, give me another one." "Together?" said Mrs. Medlock, hastily overfilling his beer mug in her excitement. "Together, ma'am," and Ben gulped down half of his new mug at one gulp. "Where was Master Colin? How did he look? What did they say to each other?" "I didn't hear that," said Ben, "only being in the step-ladder looking over the wall. But I'll tell you this, there's been things going on outside as your house people didn't know about, and what you'll find out soon." And it was not 2 minutes before he swallowed the last of his beer and waved his mug solemnly toward the window, which stood in through the shrubbery a piece of the lawn. "Look there," he said. "If thou's curious, look what's coming across the grass." When Mrs. Medlock looked, she threw up her hands and gave a shriek, and every man and woman and servant within the house bolted across the servants' hall and stood looking through the window with their eyes almost starting out of their heads. Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him. And by his side was the head in the air, and his eyes full of laughter, walked strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin. The end. So we have a happy ending. Father and son have both grown and healed. And if you would like, there are a number of copies of this movie, of The Secret Garden. It's a great movie. So I hope you enjoyed the book, and now go watch the movie. Thank you.